fine.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Textile Talk featuring the Modern Quilt Guild, and thanks for joining us. I'm Brenna, the Communications Manager for the MQG. I'm here with Karen Cooper, our Executive Director, Alissa Haight Carlton, our Founding Director, and Heather Kinion, our Board President. Before we start, if you have any technical difficulties during the presentation, please send me a note in the Q&A section and I'll chat with you to find a solution. You can always close Zoom, and when you log back in, we'll still be here. This webinar is being recorded and it will be added to the MQG resource page and to our Facebook page. We have a Q&A session at the end of the discussion and we'll get to as many questions as we can. For those of you new to Textile Talks, this is a series of weekly presentations and panel discussions from fiber art organizations, including the International Quilt Museum, Quilt Alliance, San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles, Studio Art Quilt Associates, Surface Design Association, and us at the Modern Quilt Guild. Before we begin, a little bit about the Modern Quilt Guild and our panelists. The MQG developed out of a thriving online community of modern quilters and their desire to start meeting in person. The founding quilt was formed in Los Angeles in October 2009, though through blogs and the internet, word spread quickly of the fun they were having, and soon guilds started popping up everywhere. Today, the Modern Quilt Guild is made up of more than 14,000 members and more than 200 guilds around the world. Now for an introduction of our panelists. Alissa Haight Carlton is the co-founder of the MQG and served as the organization's first executive director. She recently transitioned into a role of the MQG's founding director, and she serves as an advisory board member for the organization. In addition to her time spent quilting, Alissa is also the co-founder of Vital Casting and has been an unscripted casting director for almost 2 decades. She currently lives in Los Angeles with her husband and 2 children. Karen Cooper is our current executive director. She began quilting in 2002 when her 6-year-old daughter complained that her dolls were cold. She lives in Texas with her husband, 2 dogs, and 1 elderly cat. Her quilt-inspiring daughter is now 24 and in graduate school at the University of Arkansas. Finally, we have Heather Kinion. She is the Region 3 representative and the chair of the board of directors for the MQG. She lives in Chicago, where she splits her time between her family and her new venture, quiltpatternmart.com. Her background in the quilt world includes working for the web series Quilty, producing a podcast with Mary and Marianne Fawns, and managing projects for Quilt Folk magazine. She's a past president of Chicago MQG and has been quilting for 10 years. And with that, I will hand it over to Heather, who will be leading today's discussion of modern quilting. Take it away, Heather.
Thank you, Brenna. So we are really excited to have a little discussion here today about the Modern Quilt Guild and modern quilting. And I was going to start really thinking of it as a conversation between our first executive director and our current executive director that I'm going to moderate. First, I want to ask each of you, and maybe Alissa first, though we heard a little bit about this question, but Alissa, how did you become affiliated with the MQG?
By being a co-founder. Really, I was quilting away. This was about 2008. This was 2008. 7 and 8. I was making quilts and stumbled onto wanting to make quilts by seeing pictures on Flickr of modern quilts and seeing them and going, oh, this is what quilts, I mean, I always had a sense of quilts. My mother quilted when I was growing up, and that I wasn't scared to tackle it, but it took seeing quilts with an aesthetic that I really loved for me to really feel called to give it a shot. So I did. And I didn't know it was going to be quite so life-changing as it was. I think a lot of people feel that way about quilting, right? And really finding it change their life in so many ways. But so I was posting on Flickr, I had a blog, but there was no in-person aspect to sharing my work and hearing tips and tricks and learning how to and all this. But I could see that there was this community online. We were all talking to each other. Then it was Flickr, all commenting on Flickr. Now it's all on Instagram. But And so I really wanted to find that in real life. And so I posted on my blog just saying, like, how could we join up? How can we find each other in person? And Latifa Safir, the co-founder of the guild, commented back, and her exact words were, well, maybe we should start our own Modern Quilt Guild. And I was like, okay, let's do it. And so we started emailing, and then she was also based in Los Angeles, and the first meeting of the Los Angeles Modern Quilt Guild, which was the first Modern Quilt Guild, was in October of 2009. And we were just off and running from there, and I never could have anticipated it. I mean, I knew that I had as much passion as 14,000 members, but I didn't ever think it could actually grow to that big. But 10 years later, here it is. It's grown a ton, and it all started because actual modern quilters wanted to hang out. We were our own members from the beginning, so that's how it all started for me.
And Karen, I want to ask you the same question, because your background, getting you to the executive director position of the MQG, is your background in nonprofit administration, but your background in quilting and in modern quilting is also deep. So can you talk about how you first became affiliated with the MQG?
Sure. As the introduction stated, I've been quilting since about 2002, so about 18 years. And it was just, like Alissa, I grew up around quilting. My mom quilted, my grandma's. And so I've always had quilts around. Quilts have always been part of my life. And so Courtney, my daughter, started wanting some quilts. So I started making them, just kind of whatever fabric, just borrowed a sewing machine and just kind of dug in and, bought a book and kind of taught myself, but wasn't wildly passionate about it. Was starting to kind of see some fabrics I liked, but just the traditional aesthetic just wasn't my thing. And so I wasn't passionate about it. It was just kind of fun. And then the fabrics kind of started gradually getting better, maybe around 2009, 2010, some more fun fabrics out there. And then in 2012, it must have been, I saw, I think it was an ad in a quilting magazine, about this thing called QuiltCon. And I was like, QuiltCon sounds fun. And, started kind of digging around what I could find on the internet, found the Modern Quilt Guild. I believe the guild I must have joined, because I joined online, was the Kansas City Guild, because that was the closest to where I was living at the time. And I joined solely so that I could attend QuiltCon.
Oh, we lost her, huh?
Oh, Karen froze. The joys of live video discussions.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll get her back in a minute. We'll wait to see, but the first QuiltCon, while we're waiting for her, oh, there we go.
You were saying you saw you joined the Kansas City Modern Quilt Guild to go to the first QuiltCon. Yeah.
I joined, and so I got registered for QuiltCon. I was all excited to come to QuiltCon in Austin in 2013, and it promptly snowed 22 inches in Kansas, and so I was not able to come. But since then, I stayed a member of the Kansas City Guild, even though I never drove to Kansas City and attended any of the meetings, but I started following things online and joining the communities online and getting obviously all the newsletters. And then I've been an individual member. And then just kind of fast forward, I was doing all this other nonprofit work, this other association work. And fast forward to last June, I saw the announcement that Alissa was leaving and thought, ooh, I like quilts. I could be in charge. And here I am. So it was just kind of a roundabout, I found the quilts, found the MQG in a magazine ad, and here I am.
That's great. I'm a member of the board of directors. We were the search committee essentially for hiring the new executive director. And we just weren't sure where we would find an executive director as a quilting organization. We felt it was important to have someone who understood quilts, but also we really thought it was very important for the organization as a whole to have some more nonprofit membership and administration, especially as the organization has grown big. And we hoped that we would find that from within our membership, and we were very glad that we did. I was also going to talk about, so we talked about the MQG and sort of basically talked about the founding. there's different places to learn about that. So I was hoping that we talk a little bit more about how we grew and changed as a guild. And Alissa, you really were there for a long, running the guild from when it was a smaller organization and then formalized and then grew to a bigger organization. And do you want to talk a little bit about some of the surprises that came from growing a guild from a small local hobby? Probably, I think you probably envisioned you were starting with the LAMQG to a big organization the way it is now.
I mean, I would say that the initial surprise was just in the vast interest right off the bat. Really, it was such an organic thing initially, the growth of the MQG. I think there was a big need for, again, all these people who were talking to each other online, really wanting to get together face to face. And so the guilds themselves just started popping up organically before we formalized our nonprofit status and then formalized the membership structure where there's a, you know, the MQG that each guild is a member of, and implemented the individual membership as well. That was like when we formalized membership, we added the individual membership as well. So just that, and it grew that quickly. Really, it was in the first 5 years. I mean, there's been steady, slow growth since then, but just this clear desire. Because I'll admit that when I first was like, well, I want to meet people in person, I did Google existing quilt guilds, but they all met like weekdays on like Tuesdays at 9 or 10 a.m. And I had a job, and many of my friends who, you know, were making quilts all had small children or whatever, different reasons that was it clearly just wasn't a fit for us. And so there was this desire, and that was the initial surprise. But then, I mean, I've been consistently surprised at how much people are willing to give their hearts and time for free to the MQG. You know, there's now a paid staff who are amazing, and we've slowly grown. It started as just one person, then two, and now it's up to, what is it, Karen, five full-time staff members. So it has grown, but prior to that, and still now, there's so many people volunteering so much of their time, and it's just this combination. I think the sort of combo of a passion for the art of modern quilting, but then the community that comes with it is really what has lit this spark in so many people, and that community can be carried through from the in-person meetings to all of our online interactions, and we've been so really conscious and aware of and worked hard from day one, and this continues now, to have a very strong online presence and minimal. Try finding a phone number for the Modern Quilt Guild. You can, but it's not that easy. You can email us like that. but yeah, and I think that's actually really paid off with everything we're dealing with right now, is that the MQG's really been, and the work Karen and the staff have done in the past couple months to provide so much online content was possible because of this original, you know, foundation laying that was so web and internet based. I don't know if that really answers your question about surprises, but
well, I thought surprises sounded a little nicer than challenges, but I'm a member of the Chicago Modern Quilt Guild, and that's one of the guilds that existed and formed around the same time that LAMQG started. Our first organizational meeting was in February of 2010. It was like 4 or 5 months after yours, yeah. And I had not joined the guild yet. I didn't think I was a guild person for a while, but I know that the community in that group has been very strong, person to person, and it was very valuable to meet together. And of course, we meet on a weekend because many of our members work full time, have children. We have a wide range of ages from, I think, some of our. Well, we have some, I think we have a couple of junior members, but we also have like our members are in their 20s to their 80s, I think. So it's just a wide span of people at all different levels. And actually, I think that's one of the nicest parts of the MQG is that it really focused on that wide span of people. I'm sure that's true of other quilt guilds and different groups, but because it was designed to accommodate working lives and parenting lives as much as a hobby for after retirement, that it just changed sort of the focus of how the group happened.
And the aesthetic of the quilts themselves too appeals to a very broad range, I think. Too.
Yes, definitely. That actually, one of our questions in the came up, which we said we'd get to questions at the end, but this is a good transition to that. And they were sort of asking what specifically is the difference between a modern quilt and an art quilt. And I can man the slide deck as we answer that, so we can show some examples as well.
Karen, do you want to take this, or?
You can take it.
Okay. So what is a modern quilt is a big conversation, and the MQG from the first days it existed worked hard to create that definition, but while giving it parameters, but also leaving it big enough so that it doesn't stifle creativity or be too small, too narrow of a definition. I would say in relation to art quilts in particular, I would say that the single biggest difference is not necessarily aesthetic, but more function. In that art quilts are really specifically art. They are meant to be hung on the wall. They are not meant to be used. Modern quilts, while plenty of people are busy making them for shows and they never actually end up being used, are functional. They can be thrown in the wash. They can be thrown in the dryer. You're not likely to see embellishments, beading, that kind of stuff on them. I would say you're not going to really. Likely is not even part. So in relation to art quilts, I would say that's the clearest dividing line. From then, there are some aesthetic differences, but there's so much overlap, like the Venn diagram. You know, there's overlap there in terms of the aesthetics, because art quilts can be everything from a landscape, a very you know, photorealistic even landscape, or an image of something, all the way to completely abstract design. And with modern quilting, you see more of the abstract design end of it. But again, there's a big overlap in terms of design and aesthetic. I would say the clearest difference is function versus art.
I'm going to share our screen a little bit and show a couple of examples so we can talk about, sorry, the dog just broke into my room. So we can talk about specifics. So let me pop that up. And here we have, I picked this one to start just because this is Go North by Maritza Soto. And it is the cover of the book that the MQG published that sort of spans the first section of the MQG's growth. It has a really good defining of the beginning of the modern quilting movement beyond the MQG itself, and then also includes a lot of really wonderful quilts, many of which appeared at and many of which were award winners at various early quilt cons. QuiltCon is the show, the quilt show that we put on every year, the signature quilt show. And Go North, I think, is a good example of what Alissa was talking about. It's 69 by 70. That is a great size to live on your couch and cuddle up in. It has a really strong graphic presence that appears to be designed for visual punch in a different way than often traditional quilts with repeating blocks that repeat on a much smaller scale are designed to do. And if you look at it, it's bound just like a traditional quilt is bound. It's not faced, though many modern quilts are faced. And it could go in the wash. It is a good example of matchstick quilting, which I feel like is a very strong trend, which is very close together straight lines. I know it is a trend in art quilts as well. It's not so much a trend in traditional quilting, but definitely a very strong trend in modern quilting. And it is using very traditional elements, and it is pieced in a traditional way. It is using primarily solids rather than a lot of prints. Solid color fabrics without prints tends to be common for modern quilters. And so this is, I thought, would be a good example of that. Oh, and here's another one, smaller one, but of course it's about by Betsy Vinegrad, Mod Blocks 2.0, that is using a little bit of traditional piecing. I think it was also using a little bit of improvisational piecing to create a very bold, very influenced by contemporary art and modern art, black and white 2-color quilt there. But again, bound, has a lot in common with a traditional quilt. It looks like it could be a piece of art on a wall, like art quilts are, but isn't exactly. We could also talk about, as we showed a couple of examples, we could show a few more examples and talk about some of the trends we saw tied with the MQG and modern quilting through time. We have some examples throughout here, but some of the things that were stronger at the beginning and how they've influenced and changed as time has passed over the last decade of the MQG and even longer of the modern quilting movement. Which is probably a question more for Alissa than Karen.
Sorry, say it one more time.
It was just a question more for you, Alissa, than Karen, sort of some of the trends and the change in the arc of modern quilts, thinking about some of the ones we have in the slide deck so I can keep up with you. We can even start with our first one is, oops, that's not our first one. Our first one is the first QuiltCon Best in Show winner, Double Edged Love, a very famous Victoria Finlay Wolf quilt that was quilted by Lisa Sipes.
And I would say like one of the single best clear examples of something we call modern traditionalism. That's the phrase we came up with for taking a traditional design. This is very clearly a double wedding ring design and really giving it its own spin with and making it very graphic and modern with the choice of fabrics, with the layout, the way the piece, the interior portion is she sort of created a new fabric by piecing together other fabrics, the black and the prints in there. Overall, big picture trends, I mean, they're similar to trends you'd see in fashion or whatnot, in that a lot of them have to do with changes in color choices. The early days of, I'm seeing this pop up. This is 100% a functional quilt. This is absolutely a functional quilt. This quilt is, you can see it's large, it could be washed, it could be dried, it's bound, but yeah, a lot of the trends, like their initial quilts coming out of the modern quilting movement, the early days, the background, the negative space was almost always white. Now it's much less frequently white. You see lots of grays, you see lots of other neutral colors used, and bold, vivid colors as well. I would say also the trends you've seen change have to do with that a lot of when modern quilting movements first began, a lot of the quilters who were involved in it were new quilters. And so as these years have passed, experience has increased, ability has increased, and so you've seen a change in the actual trends of techniques being used as well. You used to see almost no hand quilting because people didn't have time for that. Now, now you see tons of hand quilting being done in the modern quilting, the quilts coming out of the modern quilting movement. To speak to, the quilts you're showing, they're all really great examples. Some of them from the early, this one's more recent. Oh yeah, here's the handwork, really handwork like crazy on this.
I skipped around to show this one, which I believe wasn't, I think it wasn't in the handwork category. I believe it won awards at QuiltCon this past year in February, but it does have a great deal of handwork obviously in it. And somebody was asking, what's the difference between modern traditionalism and a contemporary quilt? Is there a difference or just semantics? And I would say that contemporary quilts often are steeped in modern traditionalism. I feel like the difference between contemporary quilting and modern quilting is contemporary quilts make traditional blocks and traditional patterns using contemporary fabrics. So the fabrics most recently available to the making of them, whereas modern traditionalism usually we've interpreted at the MQG and at QuiltCon specifically as putting a modern interpretation on traditional blocks. There's a great example of our quilts here. This is a pine burr quilt by Tara Fawnin, which is a very traditional element of quilting that she created to make the entire quilt three-dimensional. If you went up to that quilt and flipped your hands up, all of those pieces would flip up and down with it. And
not if you were allowed to do that.
Yeah, if you were allowed to do that. If you're a Tara Fawnin and can do that at your house, not the rest of us at quilt shows. But it's a very traditional, basic quilt element that has been created with a big spin by taking it, instead of using it as a small element of embellishment, but creating it to be the focal point of the quilt. It is a little unusual for a modern quilt in that we talked about art quilts having more embellishment, a modern quilt's not, and this one has it in the element of that flag.
Yes, you know, Heather Grant, who used to work for the Modern Quilt Guild, used to say this thing that modern quilting is much like a salad bar. There's all these different elements that aesthetically you can pick from, and the best salad isn't necessarily everything on the bar. You can pick and choose, and different ones make different great salads, you know. So it's really the case.
Oh, Amanda Hines, who's one of our staff members, popped into the chat to say that it was a Judge's Choice Quilt Award at QuiltCon this year, and it was third place for modern traditional. So the one with, here, I'll go back to it, with all of the hand stitching I believe this quilter had quilts in the hand stitching category, but she also had this quilt, which won a modern traditional award. I can't remember off the top of my head the name of that quilt block that is the centerpiece of it, but it's a very traditional element.
This amazing crossing X's of sort of cross stitch, looks like cross stitch, but it's hand quilting, you know, it's really cool.
Yeah. So how have you seen the MQG and the modern quilts influence and how have you seen them influence other facets of the quilting world as it started? And Karen, you were more of a quilt consumer at this point in the world, so you could answer from that perspective. But Alissa, as the sort of the insider versus the outsider version of what you've seen the changes since the MQG started in 2009.
Go for it, Karen. You go first.
I'll start from a consumer standpoint. I was actually just talking to somebody else the other day about this, and I would say in the last 8 to 10 years, the sheer volume of more modern fabric, the diversity in solids, I can't even begin to think of. It used to be there was pretty much one line, Kona solids. I think lots of people use them. Great fabric. And then it seems in the last several years, there's, you know, every fabric company has a great line of solids with just hundreds of shades now that just simply did not exist 5 to 10 years ago. And so I think that's the better fabrics, or the more brighter fabrics, more modern fabrics. And then just the vast array of modern patterns. I know Alissa is not a real pattern user. She tends to design her own, much more so than I do. I tend to use other people's patterns and kind of alter them and go from there. But I would say, you know, 10 years ago, you had a magazine. You bought a magazine, a different here, a magazine there. You'd go to the store and buy a pattern. Whereas now you can see a quilt on Instagram or on some sort of social media, and you click on the link, and all of a sudden you're on the designer's website, and the patterns are, so many modern patterns are available. So I think modern quilting to me is very accessible. And, you know, from a consumer standpoint, if you're not, there's so much freedom to design and to come up with your own version of what you want it to look like. But then there's also it's so accessible to just go out and find all those really neat modern patterns.
Yeah. I mean, I would say my answer mirrors Karen's, in that it's just, you know, much like the actual people who were part of the modern quilting movement, the quilting world at large was also hungry for this community, for the next, the new thing to show up. It was art quilting, before, in decades ago, and modern quilting showed up and has brought a whole new group of quilters to the table. There are plenty of traditional quilters making modern quilts now, and modern quilters making traditional quilts, but then there's people who are completely brought to it through the aesthetic. I think people want to make quilts they want to have in their own homes, and so to have sort of a whole movement that defined this more modern aesthetic, and it attracted a whole new group of people. So it's the growth that I've seen. I'd say the consumer, and then being on the inside, it's the same thing. It's just been this growth, but hopefully just bringing in a whole new group of quilters. It's been great.
I think that to add on to that a little bit, I think that there's fewer rules. I think it used to, when I think of listening to my mom and my grandma talk about quilts, they were talking about the perfection of it all. How, invisible your stitches were, and your points had to be perfect, and everything had to be, there was a very strict rubric when you thought of what a good quilt was. And now I think there's a lot more acceptance and encouragement of, what do you want it to look like? And enjoying the process, and just, being a beginner is we celebrate beginners. And I just think there's just it's just a lot more accessible than quilting used to be.
I've also noticed that as I only came to quilting about 10 years ago, around the time the MQG was being born, my grandmother quilted, and so I have like a family history of it, but I sewed when I was younger through 4-H, but came back to sewing as a quilter in my late 20s, early 30s. And part of my appeal to it was that it was fun to play with all the different fabrics. And I think I came at a good time where the boom of modern and contemporary fabrics really had started at the time that I joined that. One of the questions somebody asked, which we could slip in here, is she's often asked, what is a modern quilt? And she said she doesn't quite know how to define modern quilts. And could we shed some light on the definition? I'll answer it a little bit first from my perspective, which is more of as a hobbyist maker. But modern quilts really, there's no one thing I think that a modern quilt is. It is, I think, like a next chapter that is connected in some ways to the way art quilts made changes to traditional quilts, and is sort of like another step along that way. Not necessarily, I feel like there's lots of roads heading away from those things in different directions, and one of the directions that you can go there is modern quilting, where there's a functional quilt primarily that often uses more solid colors than traditional quilters and contemporary quilters could use. It often has a bold graphic design. It can use traditional patterns and traditional blocks, and it can use improvisation to get there. And Alissa's example from Heather Grant about the salad seems to be a great way to sort of think of it. I don't know that there is a simple what is a modern quilt, unless Alissa, do you have what is a modern quilt?
Well, I was gonna say the other thing I would add in terms of relating it to both traditional and art quilts is I feel like it's a smush of the two, and that traditional quilts are functional, they're large, they're functional. Art quilts, there's this huge emphasis on design. And I think with modern quilting, you sort of blend those two, and that they're traditional they're made the same way that traditional craft is done. We piece, we quilt, we bind, we do it all. But there is this big emphasis on design as well, where I think in traditional quilting, of course, there's design involved. But once you've settled on your block design, your block choice, and your fabric choices, you're likely going to use a traditional grid setting. And so you're often running with all your decisions made. And I think modern quilting, you see much like art quilting, a lot more emphasis placed on completely original designs. Quilts that are one huge big block in their design, quilts that are completely abstract, you know, that kind of thing. But they're functional and they're used.
As we're moving past the half-hour mark, I thought we'll answer a few of the questions and then head towards wrap.
I would also just add that if people really want to read like the thorough definition, if you go to the modernquiltguild.com, it's right there on the About Us page. The MQG worked long and hard on that definition, and I think it clearly lays out what a modern quilt is without being narrow in that it allows for all of the kinds of work that are coming out of the modern quilting movement.
Someone asked in the chat, oh, Karen, did you have something to add?
I'm just going to add on to that. From there, you can link to QuiltCon, to the QuiltCon page, and see the award winners, which will give you some our categories mirror the definition very closely. And so you can see some of the outstanding examples from recent shows, as far as just to kind of see what our top spots were to get some good examples.
Somebody was asking if modern quilters, when solid prints or solid fabrics were limited by manufacturers, there just weren't as many and they weren't necessarily as available as many quilt shops, did modern quilters dye their own fabric when the commercial options were limited? And I couldn't speak for all of them. I don't think any of us could. And I'm sure some people did, but I think that part of what boosted the modern movement we talked about was the digital connection and the connection with people who are at similar stages in your life and similar creativities were happening often online. And since it was many of the early modern quilters especially, but it's true now too, were people who were working full-time or parenting small children, that they didn't maybe have time, they barely had time to make the quilts, much less to make the fabric for the quilt. So I think that it was more common to use commercial solids rather than dye their own.
Yeah, I also think hand dyed, well, there are some hand dyes I love, and I think there's more and more that appeal more and more to the modern market. A lot of what appeals to to modern quilters is a flat graphic feel to the design, and you achieve that with a flat solid, like a solid, not a muddled solid. So while you see a few more hand dyes sneaking in a bit here and there into a lot of the modern quilts being made now, you really don't see many at all in most modern quilts being made in the past 10 years, I'd say. It's really like that, because hand dyes have that sort of softness to them where they're a little muddled, and sometimes they don't translate to as stark a graphic design, I think, as most modern quilters might be looking for.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think that if you see hand dyeing, it's usually because, someone also asked about hand dyed or hand printed fabrics. I think it's usually used in a very specific way.
There are exceptions, you know, Malka Dabrowski and Austin doing hand dyes from the beginning. You know, there are exceptions, of course. Yeah.
Yes, there's always exceptions. Okay. So I'm looking at the ones that I have answered already of the questions that are coming in. Somebody asked, they came to quilting in the last 2 years. They have a background in textile design. They're also familiar with SAQA, and they were curious about the difference between ourselves and SAQA.
And SAQA?
Yeah, SAQA.
Karen, go for it. That's great.
Well, thanks for that. I mean, we are an organization that focuses on modern quilts, as Alissa and Heather have discussed the definition. And SAQA very much focuses on the art quilts and just the more of the design. I guess less functional is really, to me, function is really where the divide is. I mean, over and over to me, and I see when I see a lot of art quilts that are beautiful, amazing quilts made by the members of SAQA, just fabulous. A lot of the ones that I like the best are probably the landscapes, the things like that are amazing to me. I've seen some that are based on like an aquarium theme and things like that are just amazing. But as far as the organization, you know, we're both organizations that are places for, you know, for the people who are passionate about these styles to congregate and to share and to collaborate. But, you know, I mean, it's just two separate kinds of art.
Right, we're equivalent organizations. Our mission is about modern quilting and theirs is about art quilting. Yeah.
We actually do, this is a collaborative program with that organization, but you know, it's just simply two different focuses.
That is a great explanation. So somebody also was asking that they've re-entered quilting after a long hiatus, and the changes are kind of overwhelming for them. Guessing from the dates that they wrote in, they probably left quilting around the time or shortly after the rotary cutter came in. So how would you suggest a new quilter, possibly, or a new to modern quilter, maybe who has a big experience, but not a big experience in modern quilting, how would you suggest they ease into trying out modern quilting as a concept and see if that's a kind of quilting that they'd want to make?
Go for it.
I mean, I would say, I mean, maybe you want, I don't know, I would check out what modern quilting is aesthetically, you know, and that's easy to do in the couple of ways we mentioned on our website. I don't know if you want to bring up more pictures, Heather, just as we're talking. Yeah. I know our faces are less interesting, but and you know, the MQG has resource after resource, tons of patterns, tons of webinars, tons of resources to go through, and so you can really get a sense of all that's available. Instagram, while overwhelming, can also be just this really quick, easy way to like look at a hashtag, look at the modern quilting hashtag, look at the art quilt hashtag, look at, yeah, go ahead, Heather.
I put up this picture of Sherry Cifaldi Morrow's quilt Big Love because I know that this is a quilt that, if not exactly this quilt or a very similar version of it, she has a pattern you could buy to try your hand at making exactly that quilt, if that's a way that you try things out or learn new things. But yes, the MQG is probably the best resource for a wide variety of different ways to try, whether you are looking for a modern quilt that has pattern with instructions, either Sherry's or we have a bunch as part of our Quilt of the Month program, or improvisational quilts. This was our best in show and is actually a group quilt from 2019, Smile, no, is it Smile? Yes, by Leanne Shahaley and the Be Social. But it's it uses a variety, because it's a variety of people, of improvisational techniques using modern bright solids. I believe Leanne said that her directions for her B group was to use solid colors, any color, no neutrals.
You know, to add on to a little bit of what you all said about just how do you decide if modern quilting is for you after the hiatus, is again, you know, like Alissa said, look on social media, Instagram, you know, follow some of the hashtags. And not necessarily to promote membership in our organization, but we have, you know, for one membership, you can join and have access to over 70 different patterns and tutorials and things like that, to kind of, that you could, you know, that one can try out and see if it's something that interests you.
And, you know, the fabric, that is just lots of shopping.
Yeah.
I noticed from the chat that somebody asked, would traditional Amish quilts fit the definition of modern quilts, which is a great question. She points out solid colors, plain backgrounds, design.
I mean, they have definitely had a huge influence on the modern quilting movement. We had an Amish exhibit at the 2020 QuiltCon, the one that just happened. It feels like it was 4 years ago at this point, but they've had a huge influence on modern quilting. Absolutely. There's no question. Yeah.
And someone else mentioned that they found it interesting that we talked about the accessibility to patterns increasing with the ability to buy patterns more easily and to, you know, click a button and have it immediately on your phone or your tablet, and you can start right away. You don't have to purchase a magazine or search through magazines. You can search all online with your phone rather than with physical materials. And she found that an interesting thing because many older traditional quilters use the ability to draft a block or pattern to any size. So if they look they could essentially, anything is accessible to them from their skill level of being able to build that without needing instructions. And I wondered if either of you had thoughts on the difference between those versions of accessibility.
I would say that maybe the being able to find a pattern and download it to your phone is maybe a little more accessible and less frightening to a beginner. Because I mean, I know that when I tend to make a lot of log cabin quilts, and I'll have people who identify as beginner quilters ask me for the pattern. And I don't think about there being a pattern for a log cabin because I've made so many of them, I know how to make them. But I know that people who are beginners, and I certainly understand having been there myself, it's intimidating, it can be intimidating to just make an investment in fabric and cut it up and hope that something turns out. And so if you don't understand the traditional blocks, or you don't understand how to draft them and how to do all that, for a true beginner, to me, it's more accessible to just be able, to download a pattern and make something and to get your confidence up. So to me, that's my idea of accessibility, but I certainly understand once you know how all these blocks work, you can make anything.
And I think that this also maybe has to do more with what parts of hobby quilting you enjoy. I think for show quilters and people who are competing on a higher professional level, there's a lot of different questions, but the majority of quilters are hobby quilters. And some people absolutely enjoy the puzzle of resizing the block or rescaling it or rewriting it and recreating it, whether they're using computer software to do that or graph paper, either way. And some people don't enjoy that. They did not come to hobby quilting as math homework. And so maybe it's easier for them to just be able to figure out how to make just that without them having to do all of the steps that are required in drafting your own block. I tend to be someone who has done a lot of drafting of my own traditional blocks because, you need some graph paper and you can make it work. But it also has, especially since I've become a mother, it's much easier to just be able to click a button and start, or rip something from my magazine, or open a book and just follow the instructions rather than developing the recipe.
And that modern quilting embraces all ends of the spectrum, both from like get that pattern and make that pattern exactly as it is, all the way through to improv piecing, which is why I fell in love with quilting, where it was like, sure, you need at least a 1/4 inch seam, but you can also have a bigger one. Your quilt won't fall apart if it's bigger. I know it can't be smaller, but bigger. So improv piecing for me was like, oh, the design can continue through the labor of making. There's no perfect, there's no like matching points. It's just like, oh, I think this looks pretty sewn here, so I'm going to sew it here. That's what made me fall in love with quilting, is like, and that's so accessible to me too. And that there's no people, perfectionists won't enjoy that, but people who are put off by a need for perfection really love, I think improv piecing can be a window in too as a beginner.
Someone asked what the name of the MQG book mentioned earlier was, and it's Modern Quilts, Designs of the New Century. It's a great sort of coffee table art book full of Modern Quilt Guild QuiltCon entries primarily, but other really lovely quilts and a great primer on how the modern quilting movement began long before the modern quilt guilds were a thing, stretching back and talking about the roots. So if you're interested in that, I would highly recommend that book. And I know you can get it lots of places. So
yeah.
All right, we've got about 12 minutes left. Somebody said there's questions about the Amos question. Do we consider the G's Bend quilts modern, or quilts by Nancy Crow or Gwen Marston? And I can answer that. Both G's Bend quilters and Gwen Marston have been featured keynote speakers at QuiltCon with their own special exhibits. I feel like we consider them sort of mothers of the movement, whether they were intentionally being mothers of the modern quilting movement or not. The modern quilting movement was strongly inspired by them, and the MQG was strongly inspired by them.
Hugely inspired, yeah.
So I'm trying to click through and give us a little bit of each of the the quilts we've seen, except that I'm back at the beginning of that.
Are there any other questions?
They want to see all the quilts that are on our list before the end of that. So maybe we'll do that and talk a little bit about where Modern Quilt. I'm going to go back to the beginning and show the ones I have not shown. Actually, this is a great one to show. Bang, You're Dead. We haven't really talked about. In the Modern Quilt Guild and at QuiltCon, there are often a lot of quilts with a strong social message, and this is an early one in that in that category. It's called Bang, You're Dead by Jackie Gehring and quilted by Ann Christopher. So Jackie's husband worked at the Chicago public school system at school district at the time, and he got a report on the violence that happened to any of the students in the system every morning. And this was sort of inspired by some of the violence she saw close up through her husband through, it was made in 2015 through the years right before that. And we'll go. I showed Big Love by Sherry Spaldi Morrill and Pine Burr by Tara Fonin. My Brother's Jeans was our 2016 Best in Show winner at QuiltCon in Pasadena by Melissa Averinos. I don't know if I made sure I say her name.
I would say this quilt is a really good example on modern quilting's emphasis because it won Best in Show. And modern quilting really places more emphasis on design than technique. Now, this quilt is very well made. It's improv, but it's improv pieced and it's straight line quilted, right? It's not, in terms of the actual difficulty to physically do it. This isn't a, you don't have to be an uber expert quilter to make this quilt, but you do have to be the technical term, uber expert. You have to be a huge expert in design to make this quilt. The design impact that this quilt has is so great that it really, it's held up to be Best in Show, even though in terms of the techniques used to make it, it's not an expert quilter only an expert quilter who could execute it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I would also say this is a quilt where the design elements, I saw this quilt in person in Pasadena, and I feel like partly because it's a light quilt, it doesn't always show to its best. You can't experience as well through photographs as you could in person the sort of emotional backstory behind that quilt. Every once in a while you'll see a piece of art at a museum, or in this quilt for me anyway, where you can tell that there's a great deal of emotion that was put into the making of that quilt. This quilt was a mourning quilt in some senses. So, and you can feel that in its presence. I don't know how well that translates to the photograph of it, but standing in front of it at QuiltCon, you could sort of, I personally could feel the emotions in it. It radiated it. And I feel like that was part of, for me anyway, why I understood why that quilt at that QuiltCon was absolutely the Best in Show. It was just sort of magic in a different way than anything else that was there. Mm-hmm. This is actually by the same quilter too, so you can sort of see the difference in even the making between these two quilts that are both improvisationally pieced, but are very different, and even I feel like show different levels of difficulty.
And this is a phrase that has sort of popped up out of the modern quilting movement, improv with intent. People often think of improvisational piecing as just any old, I call it an improv mess, when it's just like any old pieces of fabric sewn together any old way. This has clear design intention, but she did not cut or piece. She didn't to set sizes or specifications as she made the quilt. She made it just by sight, just using, So totally improv piece, but with lots of design decisions with intention that create this intentional design through improv piecing.
Here's another mix of improvisational quilting, but then has very specific. It's made by Blobberella, made by Hillary Goodwin, and quilted by Krista Withers, where you can see that the quilting itself is as much responding to the improvisational, but clearly designed center elements that I believe she made the small sort of blobs first and then put them into a composition and then collaborated with the quilter on the quilting. We saw Go North by Maritza Soto, and Mod Blocks 2.0 by Betsy Weingrad, Harvest by Carson Converse. I feel like this is a good bridge quilt to the art quilt world. Carson often has quilts that can fit in the art quilt world as much as in the modern quilt world. The stripes on each of these she did by drawing with the same Sharpie. So the darkest Sharpied stripes are probably early ones, and the palest ones, every rectangle in the quilt has a series of diagonal lines, or once the Sharpie had exhausted itself. It was a very interesting
and
minimalist exercise.
Just going to say, such a good example of minimalist design, which you see a lot of in the modern quilting movement too.
Terrace by Violet Craft is a really lovely, simple piece from 2018. I think of this as another good minimalism one. I think those two might have hung next to each other actually at QuiltCon in 2018. Modern Times by Jenny Haynes in 2019. This was a modern traditional award winner. Definitely using cogs and wheels and very simple traditional elements, but in a very modern way that is moving more towards the modern than the traditional on the scale. New Lover's Knot. I actually added this one to the slideshow today because I realized there was no applique in our slideshow. This is applique by Jenny Robinson. You can see if you look sort of where the ring goes over the cross in the center of each block, because the applique allowed for the over and under that is happening there. It's a raw edge applique. And applique is, I feel, a category. We'll talk a little bit, very little bit, because we've got about 4 minutes left, about where we see things we see on the MQG and modern quilting as we move forward. Smile by Leanne Shaley, we already saw. Red Hot Radial I had up, but we hadn't talked about, by Audrey Essery from the QuiltCon this year. Very traditional. It is pieced, it is not applique. So we were just talking about applique, but this is all of a pieced quilt, a very high level of technical difficulty executed there. And then we saw Problem Solved and Beautifully Flawed. So those are all the quilts in the show. You aren't missing any now. This is a great question. You use the word modern a lot. What time frame are you attributing to modern, please? Because that's a good question.
I mean, I often say I really wish we'd have known everything that was going to happen before the words developed, right? Like the phrase modern quilting, because modern has a meaning outside of the quilting world, much like art, right? Like art quilters dealt with this 30 years ago. They said, oh, I make art quilts. People are like, what does that mean? Now you say I make art quilts, you know exactly the kind of quilts that they are talking about, right? I mean, the modern quilting movement, I would say, really started in, it's hard to give a firm number, right? Like Denise Schmidt making quilts in the early 2000s, and Weeks Ringel and Bill Kerr as well. But yeah, I mean, there's no denying that the difficulty with the use of that word is that as time passing, are those first quilts that were made in the, yes, 21st century, yes. That's it. Sorry, I just saw the comment pop up here. It says, so 21st century. Yeah, the modern quilting movement really started then and continues on up.
And one thing that we always talk about on staff when we're thinking about, quilts and during quilts into QuiltCon is that modern, by its very meaning of the word, our definition may continue to evolve. I mean, it's not, necessarily static for the rest of time. I mean, we'll see, we'll see where the future takes us.
Yeah, do we have a last wrap up on what you hope, I guess, maybe not see, but hope for the modern quilt guild in its next 10 years, now that we're in our second decade?
I'm excited just to see us continue to grow and to see the passion for modern quilting continue to grow. It's exciting to see, Alissa kind of mentioned a little bit, and you also, the range of ages that we have. It's exciting to go to QuiltCon. Probably my personal favorite quilt from QuiltCon was a 7-year-old this year. that she had designed her own quilt, and her and her mom made it happen. And so I see us continuing to grow just because, again, it's accessible, there's fewer rules, people are continuing to want to express themselves through textiles or through making. And I think that we provide that outlet. Modern quilting provides that outlet.
Yeah. Yeah. I hope that it continues to broaden quilting interest, you know? I mean, that's what it's done till now. And I hope that just continues, this traditional craft of sewing through 3 layers that somehow just calls everybody's name. I mean, I was sewing together log cabin blocks yesterday and pressing, and I was like, what is it about just pressing a seam flat that is so satisfying, right? Like, why do we love that so much? But every quilter loves that. And the more aesthetics that are represented in all of quilting, the more quilters there will be. And so I hope that modern quilting just continues to grow and branch out and include more people with that modern aesthetic.
Right. Thank you, guys. I must say thank all of you for coming to be our audience this afternoon, or whatever time of day it is. I saw that we had many different places represented by people in the chat. Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions, but I hope we answered a lot of them. Thank you, Karen and Alissa, for making time to speak with us. And thank you to everyone who's made the Textile Talks possible. We were thrilled to be a part of it. So, all right. Thank you all for having us. And we hope you have a very nice day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.